Externalities exist because of incomplete property rights, or from the difficulty of enforcing property rights in different situations. Property rights are the rights of individuals or businesses to have the exclusive use of their property, which includes the right to buy or sell it. Now, this can be for physical or intangible objects. In the case of pollution, the lack of property rights or the difficulty in enforcing property rights is, you can imagine, the right to breathe clean air. Because no one has any rights to the atmosphere, no property rights to the atmosphere, it's difficult and impossible in some situations to actually enforce a firm from polluting it. There's no one to bring damages, and there's no court that would be able to handle it. How can complete property rights solve the externality problem? Let's suppose there's a farmer and a paper mill that both share a stream. If no one owns the stream, the paper mill will discharge waste into the stream, which makes it unusable for the farmer. If the farmer owns the stream, he can prevent the mill from discharging into the stream. He can legally prevent that. Or he can allow the mill to discharge their waste into the stream, but for a fee, so that way it's beneficial to him. He can decide if the amount of money that the mill is willing to pay to pollute that stream is worth the fact that he can't use the stream now. Either way, whether it allows the mill to put their pollution in it while paying him or prevents them from polluting into the stream, the property rights avoid the market failure. The farmer, in this case, if the farmer owns a stream, is able to be compensated for any externalities that exist when there are no property rights to the stream. This idea of individuals having property rights and bargaining so that we reach a more optimal, a better situation that exists with externalities gives rise to the Coase theorem. Ronald Coase was a Nobel laureate in economics, and he argued that private parties could solve the externality problem through private bargaining. Now, this could happen if property rights are assigned and enforceable, so they are known, someone can definitely own that property, and then it can be enforced by a legal authority, and transaction costs are low. So the actual amount of time and money it takes to reach an agreement is fairly low. So this idea has come to be known as the Coase theorem, and it's been named after him. And the Coase theorem also requires that parties have full or have close to full information about the costs and the benefits involved. First, we'll work with the Coase theorem, explain it more in depth, see how it works, and then we'll examine how likely it is for these assumptions to hold. Now, the most interesting and the most novel part of Coase's theorem is the important observation that it did not matter to whom property rights were assigned. It does not matter which party in the agreement gets the property rights initially, that they will end up contracting and reaching an agreement that's beneficial for both of them. So in the example of the paper mill and the farmer, we said that if the farmer had the enforceable property rights over the stream, if the farmer was the one that actually owned the stream, the externality problem could be resolved. But the same is true if the paper mill owns the stream. Let's see an example of this in the real world, something that could happen to you, something you could see in your own life. Talking about reclining seats on an airplane. So does the person sitting in front of you when you're sitting on an airplane, do they have the right to recline their seat? The answer seems to be yes. It's commonly accepted for people to be able to recline their seat. So if we're thinking about this in terms of Coasean bargaining, the person sitting in front of you, they have the property right to be able to recline their seat. So a couple years ago, the New York Times columnist Josh Barro suggested that the Coase theorem allows for a solution. If you're sitting there and the person in front of you reclines their seat too far, it's making you uncomfortable, you don't have enough room, you can put the Coase theorem to action in real life and offer to pay the person in front of you to not recline their seat. So the question, do you think transaction costs are small enough here for the Coase theorem to apply? Transaction costs should be low because there's only two individuals involved in this. It's you and the person in front of you. So it should be easy to find that person. Again, they're right there. And then you only have to reach an agreement with one person. If there's many people that you're trying to contract with, it can make it very difficult. So if it's a mill and not just one farmer, but a mill in an entire town, it can be difficult for the mill owner to go and talk to every single person in the town to get them to agree to it. But if it's just two parties like we see with the airplane, it can be very easy to solve that problem. The transaction costs should be fairly low. Here's a screenshot of a tweet I found, it must have been a year and a half ago, that I've saved to use in my Econ 1 to 2 classes when we talk about Gaussian bargaining. Cam Newton, quarterback for the Carolina Panthers at the time, he was traveling on a plane and offered a man $1,500 to give up his seat with extra legroom so that Cam Newton, who is quite tall, can sit in that seat. And the article kind of makes fun of the guy for turning down that much money just to switch seats. That's an example of an attempt at Gaussian bargaining. However, the man turned him down, so it ended up not going through, didn't take place in the real world like it could have, unfortunately. In Chapter 4, we learned that taxes caused inefficiency, dead weight losses, by moving the level of production away from the efficient level, so move the market out of equilibrium when it was in equilibrium. In this chapter, we talked about how externalities cause that same inefficiency for the same exact reason. And it works basically the same way, the same basic function that taxes do, how taxes move the economy out of equilibrium. So, in theory, a tax of just the right size in the opposite direction could cause the two effects to cancel each other out. It can completely counteract the externality, returning us to the efficient level of production. Let's return to the example we were using in the previous section, utilities producing electricity. Now, because utilities do not bear the full cost of pollution, they end up producing too much electricity, and thus too much pollution. Looking at our figure here on the right, S1 is the marginal private cost before the tax, and S2 represents the social marginal cost and the marginal private cost, in this case, after the tax has been implemented. So now the quantity that's being produced in the market, again, is going to be higher than what the efficient quantity is when you take into account the social cost of the pollution. So now if the government imposes a tax which is equal to the cost of pollution, that will shift the supply curve from S1 to S2. So the marginal social cost will be equal to the marginal private cost after the tax has been added. The market equilibrium quantity is going to fall to the efficient equilibrium quantity. The equilibrium quantity that would be in existence if the utilities took into account the cost of the pollution. As economists, what we say is that this tax has caused the utility to internalize the externality. So they are now bearing the cost of the externality because of that tax. So initially, the price was at P market, which does not include the cost of the acid rain. Remember, this is the actual price that's out on the market when the producer is not considering the social cost is going to be inefficiently low. It's going to be too low than if the utilities, the producer of electricity, took into account the full social cost, including pollution. When we add a tax, when the government adds a tax that is equal to the externality, what it's going to do is increase the price as well from the market price to the efficient price. That's going to accompany the lower quantity of electricity that's being produced. Now, in this case, consumers are going to be paying the efficient price. They're going to be paying the higher price. But now the tax is going to be equal to the difference between the two supply curves. So just like when we had a tax in the previous chapter, what's going to happen is at that efficient quantity, the producer, so in this case the utilities producing the electricity, is going to receive where the efficient quantity that's being produced crosses the original supply curve. So it's going to be less than the original market price. Taxes work to solve the problem of negative externalities for two reasons. First, negative externalities cause too much to be produced. There was an overproduction. So taxes make the products more expensive. And also, taxes reduce the amount of output. Now, when there are positive externalities, too little will be produced. So taxes will not have the proper effect. They're going to make the externality even work. However, subsidies can work. Subsidies are amounts paid to producers or consumers in order to encourage them to produce more or to consume more of a certain good. Let's return to our previous example of positive externalities. Individuals going to college. So individuals make a decision about whether or not to consume a college education with the resulting market price and quantity. But if there are positive externalities to a college education, then they're not going to consume enough. It is good for us as a society if other people are smart and make good decisions. If they become more educated and they become more productive workers, they take better jobs, let alone they're better people to be around. Maybe they're more informed, so they have better voting habits. There's a whole list of things that college education is associated with that are positive. This is an argument that not enough people are consuming a college education because they're not receiving the full benefits of a college education. So this is an argument for a subsidy in the market for college education. Now, a subsidy is going to work just like a tax, but in the opposite direction. So what it's going to do is shift the demand curve from D1, which is the marginal private benefit before the subsidy, to D2, which is the marginal social benefit. It's also going to be now, because of the shift, the marginal private benefit plus the subsidy. The market equilibrium quantity is going to shift from Q market to Q efficient, so it's going to increase. Producers will also receive the price, which is shown here on the figure of P efficient. So the price that they receive is going to increase. So it's going to encourage firms, in this case colleges, to produce more education or more opportunities for education, more seats available for students. Now, because of the subsidy, individuals aren't going to pay the efficient price or even the market price. They're going to end up paying a lower price, and then the government is going to make up the difference with the subsidy. The taxes and subsidies that we showed in the previous few slides act to correct the externality problem. They're known as Pigouvian taxes and subsidies, named after the English economist A.C. Pigou, who first demonstrated the use of government taxes and subsidies in bringing about an efficient level of output in the presence of externalities. Pigouvian taxes are especially popular with economists because they increase efficiency while bringing in tax revenue. So it's bringing in two benefits. First of all, the economy moving towards equilibrium, so we're increasing economic surplus, both consumer surplus and producer surplus. And it also helps raise funds for the government. So while taxes also, a lot of taxes are distortionary, so income tax or the per unit taxes we were talking about earlier, they reduce economic efficiency. In this case, they actually increase economic efficiency. And this double benefit, this dual benefit, is called the double dividend of taxation. So I mentioned before that it's very difficult to estimate supply and demand curves. It takes a lot of time, some statistical techniques, and you can't be certain. You can only sort of estimate. And it's impossible to know in real time what the demand curve is. You have to use data to look backwards. So this can present troubles for someone trying to design an appropriate Pigouvian tax. You have to try to estimate what the supply and demand curves are for the good with the externality present, and then you need to design a tax that perfectly offsets it. This is incredibly difficult to do. Maybe you could get it going in the right direction, but to get it right, the perfect estimation is going to be very difficult, if not impossible to do. And even A.C. Pigou, when designing or coming up with this theory and using it in practice, he still had his doubts that it was perfect. This is a great ideal and it's perfect for the chalkboard, but much like Cosine bargaining, how I showed the example of it not working in the real world, and I think many of you would find it awkward to try to pay a stranger who's sitting in front of you on a plane to move their seat up. There's also problems with Pigouvian taxes. So neither of these two are perfect alternatives to deal with externalities. Let's make a connection with Pigouvian taxes in the real world. So should we tax cigarettes and soda? The consumption of cigarettes and soda are thought to have negative externalities. And why is this? They both have severe negative health consequences for individuals. Cigarettes also cause quite a bit of pollution around the smoker as they're consuming the cigarette. But negative health consequences by itself is not sufficient to be a negative externality. When people's medical expenses are shared with others, which is more and more commonly becoming the case, either via public or private health insurance, that's when these negative health consequences become negative externalities and become a serious cost to other people not involved in those transactions, whether we're talking about consuming soda or smoking cigarettes. Therefore, because of these negative externalities and sharing medical costs, we would expect too much consumption of both cigarettes and soda, and that they would be candidates for Pigouvian taxes. In general, cigarettes are taxed much more heavily than soda. There's a question of, is this appropriate? Now let's use our supply and demand model in order to explore in more depth the possibility of taxing soda. So original demand curve, D1, is the marginal private benefit that individuals get before the tax. D2 is the marginal social benefit, and it's the marginal private benefit after the tax has been applied. So now the amount of the soda tax is going to equal, in theory, the negative externality resulting from the consumption of soda. So now what is this going to do? So it's going to decrease the quantity soda that's being purchased. It's going to move from quantity market to the quantity efficient. The price that's being paid by consumers is going to increase. It's going to increase from P market up to P in this diagram. Now the price received by producers is going to be less than that, and it's going to be the exact amount of the soda tax. So now P efficient is going to be below the original market price, and the price paid by consumers is going to be above the original market price. So now producers, because they're receiving less money, are encouraged to produce less. They're not going to produce as much soda and try to sell it to individuals because it's now they're receiving a lower price. And because consumers have to pay more out of pocket for soda, they're going to demand more. So in this case, if the soda tax is equal to the negative externality, it's going to move the private demand curve in line with the societal demand curve. Now, an alternative to Coasian bargaining and to Pigouvian taxes is the most traditional solution to externality problem, and that's called command and control. Your command and control policy that involves the government imposing quantitative limits on the amount of, say, pollution that firms are allowed to emit, or requiring firms to install specific pollution control devices. It's basically the government directing firms what they're allowed to do. So an example is requiring car manufacturers to equip cars with catalytic converters. That was a command and control solution that the government implemented decades ago. But this gives rise to a problem. What if firms have very different costs of reducing pollution? It would not be efficient for them to reduce pollution by the same amount. To put that differently, the same amount of pollution reduction could be achieved with a much lower cost. So let's look at alternative ways to design this. Let's examine two car manufacturers. Let's suppose Ford can reduce their pollution in its cars very cheaply, while GM has much higher costs of reducing pollution. If we want to achieve a particular level of pollution reduction, it would be efficient to ask Ford to reduce pollution more than it would to ask GM, because it's so much more expensive for GM to try to reduce their pollution. This doesn't seem fair to Ford. Why should GM be held to a lesser standard just because Ford can more cheaply reduce the pollution in its cars? So the efficient solution has Ford perform more pollution reduction, most or all of the pollution reduction, but then have GM compensate Ford for that. Both companies can be made better off compared to requiring them both to reduce pollution by a moderate amount, while keeping the amount of pollution reduction the exact same as before. Now, what does this sound like? This sounds like Coasian bargaining. There's also the concept behind the tradable emissions permits, which used to be called cap and trade. So the government establishes an allowable amount of emissions. They say, we want X amount of total emissions. You are not allowed to go anywhere above that. And then emissions permits are distributed. So each firm gets a certain amount of permits. Maybe they all get the same, or they all get the same percentage based on how many people they're serving, whatever. however they decide to emit those. They do it the most fair way possible. Then firms can trade emission permits. So firms with a high cost of reducing pollution, maybe they're very efficient, they're producing very little pollution. So for them to be able to reduce pollution would be very expensive. They would have to do something radical to be able to reduce their pollution much lower than what they were doing before. What they'll end up doing is buying permits from firms that have a low cost of reducing pollution. So say these firms that are polluting a lot, and it'd be easy for them to switch from, say, burning like a dirtier coal to a cleaner coal, or switching up whatever. Maybe they're using older, less efficient machines that are producing more pollution, and it would be cheap for them, or relatively cheap for them, to just buy new machines. This helps ensure that pollution is being reduced at the lowest possible cost, rather than increasing the cost to make some very efficient producers of electricity from polluting. Hence, in this case, there is still some government oversight, some government regulation, but the market is being used to achieve the efficient pollution reduction strategy. Back in 1990, Congress enacted a cap-and-trade system for sulfur dioxide emissions. As a result, there were improvements in the pollution reduction technology, and the cost of compliance ended up being almost 90% less than firms initially estimated. This program was very effective. It was cost-effective, and it was effective at reducing sulfur dioxide emissions. And the benefits were at least 25 times the cost of implementing the program, which is almost unheard of. However, cap and trade suffers from some image problems. Environmentalists objected to cap and trade, considering it to give firms a license to pollute. But pollution does have a benefit. It allows for cheap production, and sometimes it's the only way to produce goods, is to have some pollution. Every production decision uses up some scarce resource, whether that's time, natural resources, clean air, labor, what have you. It uses up some resources. Some resources need to be combined to produce this good. So in this sense, paying for using clean air seems appropriate. Also, it was effective in reducing pollution, which should be noted even though environmentalists opposed cap and trade. Now, another serious concern is that cap and trade may produce so-called hotspots, or locations where a lot of pollution takes place. This would be the case if a lot of firms with a high cost of pollution reduction were geographically close. So say these firms, instead of being very efficient and producing very little pollution, the reason that it's expensive for them to reduce their emissions because they're polluting a lot, but that's really their only option. If a lot of them are clustered together for some geographic reason, that could cause some small areas where there's a lot of pollution, so people living near there would still suffer the consequences of pollution. What the cap and trade system does is it alters who pays for the pollution. No matter what, someone is going to be paying for the pollution, or they're going to be suffering for the pollution. When the pollution is unregulated, all consumers bear the consequences of pollution. Because there are no property rights to the air, we haven't figured out a way to do that yet. People that are breathing the air, so basically everyone who's breathing the air, has to bear the consequences, and there's no way to hold the polluters accountable. When cap and trade was enacted, the cost of pollution was borne directly by firms. They were paying for the level of pollution that they were creating. Now, polluting firms tend to be able to organize better lobbying efforts because consumers feel the cost of pollution diffusely. So each consumer has a very low cost of experiencing pollution, whereas firms have a very high cost. So this illustrates the classic special interest problem in politics, which we may be able to get into near the end, but that small groups are better able to organize than large groups. So even if large groups can have a big benefit combined from organizing, because each individual within that group gets a small benefit themselves, it's more efficient. It's better for them. It costs less for them to just sit out and to not care about it. So small groups are able to better organize and better able to get laws passed that benefit them.